This week I used Google Maps, some wood, and some epoxy, and I turned it into a pretty cool piece of wall art. Enjoy. So this build is actually a really cool do-it-yourself gift idea. If you know someone that has a cottage or somewhere specifically around a body of water, this works perfect. In my case, I need to make it using Chaumont Bay Lake Ontario. I'm going to be freehanding all of this with pretty much basic woodworking tools, so no CNC or anything like that. To start off, I basically just built a picture frame, and I made the dado about a 1/4 inch deep to hold a 1/4 inch plywood panel. The frame is going to serve two purposes. It's obviously for the decoration, and in this case it's going to be the mold for the epoxy pour as well. After the 1/4 inch plywood panel was glued in place, I then took my tablet, went on Google Maps to the location I needed, and just freehanded the piece of land directly on the plywood panel. I took parchment paper, cut it to the size of the frame, and could then transfer those drawings to the parchment paper. I used the parchment paper to do this because it was see-through. And if you're wondering why I didn't cut the paper to size in the beginning and then just draw directly on the paper, you're not alone. Now looking back, watching this footage, I'm wondering the same thing. Anyway, I then roughly cut the pieces out of the parchment paper. The pieces of land are going to be cut using 1x pine material. So what I did was put the pieces of paper over the wood and then traced it on the wood to give me my reference where to cut. To cut out the pieces, I used a jigsaw with a really fine finishing cutting blade to get into all the curves. Once those were all cut out, I made sure everything fit in the frame how I liked it. And because the pieces just were slightly different from my original sketch on the panel, I traced a new line around where the pieces of wood were. This would give me a reference of where I need to glue each piece. Before I did that, I gave all the pieces a quick round over with my router and sanded them so it was smooth to the touch. I brushed on glue inside my referenced lines and glued the pieces in place. Once that glue was dry, I caulked around the wood where it met the panel. This would stop any air that might be trapped under the wood pieces to come up through the epoxy when I pour that. I also used my laser engraver to label any landmarks, as well as put a compass in the bottom corner. At this point, you probably guessed it, I'm using epoxy resin for the water. I mixed up a main batch of the sea blue color, as well as a small batch that I tinted white to create waves in the epoxy. I poured all of the blue first, then took the white epoxy and a blow dryer to create the waves. Chaumont Bay has a bunch of different small bays within it, so I laser engraved little pieces of 1/8 inch plywood and placed them on top of the epoxy where I wanted them to go. Once the epoxy was set up and cured, I gave the frame one final sanding, mixed up a brown and white stain, get a color I liked, being careful not to get it on the epoxy. If I were to do this again, I would stain and poly all the wood pieces before the epoxy pour. I didn't like that the wood was all the same color, so I went back and used a darker stain to put it on the frame to create a little contrast and separation. I did spray poly over the wood pieces, but because of that, the overspray got onto the epoxy and it matted the epoxy and just didn't have that shine to it. That's why I would definitely poly the wood pieces separately before pouring the epoxy. But to fix this, I did one more final clear pour to bring the glossiness back and was much happier with it. So that's it, just a quick one today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.